Picture this. You're alone in your dorm room. Midnight has just passed. The campus is silent, no laughter from hallways, no chatter from roommates. Just the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. You're flipping through your textbook, trying to shake off a strange restlessness. And then, you hear it. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. They echo in the stillness, sending a chill through your spine. Now imagine this. It's a normal school day. You're joking with friends by your locker when the lockdown alarm blares, piercing through the chatter like a knife. At first, you think it's just another drill. But then, the announcement comes. This is not a drill. You hear the gunshots. You see the panic. And you realize, this could be your last day. Or worse yet, you're sitting in class, staring at the clock. The alarm pulls you out of your daydream. Lockdown protocol kicks in. You and your classmates crouch under desks. But something feels wrong. You hear footsteps. A voice over the intercom. And before you know it, the nightmare begins. These are the moments no one sees coming. Moments when ordinary days take a dark turn, leaving fear, tragedy, and questions that never get answered. Tonight, we bring you 3 terrifying true stories of school lockdowns. Stories of survival and loss. Stories that will make you question just how safe we really are when the doors lock and the lights go out. Before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't watch this alone. Share it with someone who loves a good scare, and let's get started. First story. The story I called the Midnight Visitor. It was a quiet Wednesday night on campus. The kind of night when the world feels far away. The air was still, the kind of stillness that made every little sound seem louder than it should be. Most students were asleep, tucked away in their rooms, their dreams undisturbed. But for one student, sleep was the last thing on their mind. They didn't know it yet, but that night would mark the beginning of something they would never forget. The dorm's common room was almost too quiet. The hum of the old refrigerator, the soft ticking of a wall clock, the occasional groan of the building settling into itself, these were the only sounds that broke the silence. They had stayed up late, flipping through the pages of a textbook, though they weren't really studying. Something kept them awake, some restlessness they couldn't explain. The clock struck midnight, and the stillness deepened. That's when they heard it. 3 knocks. Slow. Methodical. Just loud enough to be heard but soft enough to make you question if you really heard it at all. They froze. For a moment, they convinced themselves it was nothing. Maybe the wind, maybe a random creak from somewhere in the building. But then it came again. 3 knocks. This time, there was no mistaking it. They stood up, their heart beginning to race. The common room was empty, dimly lit by the glow of a single overhead light. They glanced toward the door, half expecting someone to step through it, but nothing happened. Their hand hesitated on the doorknob. There was no logical reason to be afraid, and yet every instinct screamed at them to turn around, to leave it alone. But curiosity, as it so often does, got the better of them. They opened the door. Kara Welsh stood on the other side. They knew her, everyone on campus knew Kara. She was the kind of person you couldn't help but notice. A gymnast, always smiling, always surrounded by friends. But this wasn't the Kara they knew. Her hair clung to her face in damp, tangled strands, as though she'd been caught in a downpour. Her eyes were wide and wild, darting around like she expected something to leap out of the shadows. And her clothes, they were smeared with something dark. Something that didn't belong there. "Let me in," she choked out. Before they could respond, Kara pushed past them, stepping into the room. She stood in the center, her back to them, her shoulders trembling. "Kara," they finally managed to say, their voice shaking. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer at first. When she turned, just slightly, they noticed the red smear on her skin. Blood. They stepped back instinctively, their breath catching in their throat. "What happened?" Her voice was barely audible. "She won't leave me alone." "Who?" they asked, trying to understand. Kara's gaze darted toward the window, then back to the floor. Her movements were jerky, almost as if something was pulling her in directions she didn't want to go. "He's watching," she whispered. "He's always watching." The words sent a shiver down their spine. "A stalker?" they asked, trying to make sense of her panic. Kara shook her head, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "I didn't mean to do it," she said suddenly. "Do what?" She turned to face them fully now, her eyes glassy with tears. Her voice broke as she spoke. "It was an accident. But he won't stop. He's here. He's everywhere." They moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain to look outside. The campus was empty, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the ground. But there was no one there. Behind them, Kara's breathing grew heavier. Her sobs turned into gasps, broken and ragged, as if she were struggling to keep herself together. Then, the door burst open. The sound was deafening, shattering the fragile tension in the room. They turned, and there he was. A man stood in the doorway, his face hidden by shadows. His presence filled the room with a weight that was impossible to ignore. He raised a gun. And then the shots rang out. Kara's body crumpled to the floor, her lifeless eyes staring at nothing. Blood pooled around her, the stark red against the pale carpet burning into their memory. The man didn't look at them. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as though he had never been there. The hours that followed were a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and unanswered questions. The man was caught the next day, a classmate, they said. But no one could explain why Kara had been his target. No one could explain the strange look in her eyes or the words she had said before she died. And even though the dorm was cleared, its residents moved to other buildings, the questions lingered. Rumors began to spread. Some said Kara had been haunted by something that followed her to her death. Others claimed her ghost never left the dorm. Students swore they heard knocking in the middle of the night. 3 knocks, always slow and deliberate, coming from behind the door of a room that hadn't been used since. And every time someone new heard the sound, they would wonder, was it Kara? Or was it something else entirely? Second story. When the lockdown alarm sounded, most thought it was another drill. The blaring siren echoed through the hallways, bouncing off the lockers and forcing students to stop mid-conversation. Some rolled their eyes, annoyed at yet another interruption to their day. Others barely paid attention, accustomed to the all-too-frequent practice runs. But for one student, the sound wasn't just another drill. For him, it was a reckoning. At first, the announcement over the intercom seemed like all the others. The dean's voice, sharp and commanding, instructed everyone to proceed to their designated lockdown areas. Classrooms locked their doors, and teachers herded students into corners, whispering reassurances they didn't quite believe themselves. But there was a shift, subtle at first, that made it clear this wasn't like the others. The dean's voice trembled ever so slightly, cracking at the edges, as though she was struggling to keep control. That's when the first gunshot rang out. It wasn't a firecracker. It wasn't a prank. It was unmistakable, a single, deafening crack that silenced every whisper and every shuffle in the school. In an instant, the playful frustration turned to fear. Students huddled closer together. Teachers' reassurances faltered. And somewhere in the chaos, the weight of what was happening began to sink in. For one student and their two friends, the instinct to survive kicked in immediately. They exchanged panicked glances as the second gunshot echoed through the halls, closer this time. The adrenaline pushed them to their feet. Without a word, they moved quickly, relying on the layout of the school and what little they knew about its hidden corners. Alex remembered a maintenance hallway. It wasn't on any of the maps and was rarely used, but a janitor had once shown them the door marked "Employees Only." It was narrow and cramped but offered a way out. Alex whispered to their friends to follow, and they moved as quietly as they could, leaving the chaos behind. The hallway smelled of bleach and old floor wax, the air thick and musty. The further they moved, the quieter it became, though the distant sound of muffled screams and hurried footsteps still lingered. Alex led their friends deeper into the corridor, hoping the maintenance door at the other end would lead them to safety. Then, the intercom crackled to life. It wasn't the dean this time. It was Mr. Higgins, one of the teachers. His voice was strained, trembling, as though he was speaking under duress. "They deserve to know," he said. There was a pause, and then the dean's voice cut in, sharp and angry. "Not now. You'll cause a panic." Mr. Higgins's voice wavered but didn't stop. "We knew this could happen. We let it happen. And now." The intercom abruptly went silent, leaving only static before it clicked off entirely. Alex and their friends froze, exchanging worried looks. What did they mean by, "we knew"? What was the administration hiding? As they reached the maintenance door and pushed it open into the back lot, the cold air hit them like a slap, waking them from the fog of fear. For a moment, they thought they were safe. But that's when they saw him. A figure stepped out of the shadows near the fence. He moved slowly, deliberately, until the faint light from a street lamp illuminated his face. It was Eric. Eric had been a student at the school not long ago. Alex recognized him immediately. He wasn't just any student, he had been quiet, reserved, but well-liked by those who knew him. That changed after the incident with his girlfriend. She had been assaulted on school grounds, and while the whispers spread quickly, the administration did everything they could to silence them. They hushed up the investigation, claimed it was inconclusive, and brushed aside any responsibility. For Eric, that was the final betrayal. Now, he stood before them, dressed in black, his face partially obscured by a mask. In his hand, he held a gun. For a moment, Eric didn't say anything. He simply stared, his eyes cold and empty, as though the person he once was had disappeared entirely. Alex stepped forward instinctively, raising their hands. "Eric, you don't have to do this." Eric tilted his head slightly, as if considering their words. "Do you even know what they did?" His voice was calm, too calm, and that was almost more terrifying than if he had been shouting. "They knew," Eric continued, his grip on the gun tightening. "They knew what happened to her. They let it happen. They let him walk away." "This isn't the way to fix it," Alex said, their voice trembling but steady enough to keep going. "Hurting people isn't going to make it right." Eric's eyes flashed with something, anger, pain, maybe both. "They need to pay," he said quietly. "If no one else will hold them accountable, I will." The world seemed to slow down as Eric raised the gun. But instead of aiming it at Alex, he turned and walked back toward the school. Alex wanted to stop him. They wanted to scream, to do something. But fear kept them rooted in place. Minutes later, the police arrived. Alex told them everything they could, pointing the officers toward the maintenance hallway. Shots rang out again soon after, but when it was over, no students had been harmed. Eric was taken into custody, his mission incomplete. The school tried to downplay what had happened, but the truth couldn't be silenced this time. Whispers about the assault resurfaced, along with questions about how much the administration had known. Alex couldn't stop thinking about Eric's final words. Was he a monster, Or was he someone pushed too far by a system that failed him? Could things have been different if someone had listened? Eric had chosen the wrong path. But somehow, the world around him had led him there. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. Story 3: The Masked Truth. Sometimes, the person you fear most is the one you love the most. It started like any other day at school. The clock on the classroom wall ticked steadily, the sound blending into the monotony of a dull history lecture. Students shifted restlessly in their seats, some doodling in notebooks, others counting down the minutes until the bell rang. But one student, Alex, had his thoughts elsewhere. His twin brother, Jake, hadn't shown up for school again. Jake had been skipping more often lately, his absences growing harder to ignore. Alex couldn't blame him, not really. PE had become unbearable for Jake. Mr. Grady, the coach, seemed to single him out at every turn. Whether it was mocking his performance during drills or making him the butt of cruel jokes in front of the class, Mr. Grady never missed an opportunity. And when Jake's classmates saw the teacher treating him that way, it was like permission to pile on. The bullying escalated. Jake had always been sensitive, the kind of person who felt things deeply but kept it to himself. He used to talk to Alex about everything, but over the past few months, he'd withdrawn. The light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something Alex couldn't quite recognize. The first sign that something was wrong that day was the lockdown alarm. It blared suddenly, cutting through the droning lecture and sending the entire class into confusion. At first, the students thought it was just another drill. The teacher's calm but hurried instructions didn't feel out of the ordinary. Everyone moved to their assigned places, crouching beneath desks as the lights were turned off. But then, the announcement came. The principal's voice was shaky, her words breaking as she told the school this wasn't a drill. Alex's stomach sank. The room fell silent except for the muffled sounds from the hallway, footsteps, faint and deliberate. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening in the stillness. Alex's heart raced, pounding so loudly it seemed impossible the others couldn't hear it. And then the first gunshot echoed through the halls. The sound was sharp and final, shattering any remaining doubt. Someone was out there, armed and dangerous. The teacher whispered for the students to stay quiet, but the fear was tangible, pressing in on them like a heavy weight. Alex's thoughts immediately went to Jake. Where was he? Was he safe? The idea of their brother being anywhere near this chaos was unbearable. The second gunshot came, louder and closer this time. And then, silence. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The silence was broken only by the occasional shuffle or whispered reassurance, but no one truly believed they were safe. When the next announcement came, it wasn't from the principal. A distorted voice crackled through the intercom. The dean fulfills my demands, or I start killing hostages. The voice was cold, detached, and unfamiliar. The words hung in the air, freezing everyone in place. The principal's response came moments later. Her voice was trembling but firm. We do not negotiate with threats. The intercom clicked off, leaving the class in stunned silence. Alex's mind was racing. Hostages? Demands? None of it made sense. And then, the fear became personal. The voice returned over the intercom, this time naming the hostages, students in room 306. Alex felt their chest tighten as they recognized one of the names, Emily. Emily was Alex's crush, someone they had admired from afar but never had the courage to approach. The thought of her in danger ignited something in Alex, a need to act, to do something, anything, to help. When the teacher's focus shifted, Alex slipped out of the room unnoticed, moving through the empty halls with careful, quiet steps. The gunshots had stopped, but the tension in the air was suffocating. As Alex approached room 306, they spotted a maintenance room nearby and ducked inside. From there, they could see into the classroom through a small glass window. Inside, Emily and 5 other students were tied to chairs. The shooter stood by the window, his back to the door, occasionally glancing outside at the police cars gathering in the distance. Alex's breath caught. Something about the way the shooter moved, the way he stood, was familiar. Heart pounding, Alex grabbed a wrench from a nearby shelf, gripping it tightly. They crept closer, their mind racing with fear and determination. As they opened the door quietly, the shooter didn't turn. In one swift motion, Alex swung the wrench. The sound of metal connecting with bone was sickening. The shooter crumpled to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand. For a moment, everything was still. The hostages scrambled to their feet, rushing past Alex and out of the room. Police stormed in seconds later, shouting commands and taking control of the scene. It was over. Or so Alex thought. When they reached down to pull off the shooter's mask, his world shattered. Jake. His twin brother lay unconscious on the floor, blood pooling around his head. Alex stumbled back, his mind reeling. How could this be possible? Later, the truth came out. Jake had planned the attack for weeks. He had skipped school to avoid suspicion, using the time to map out his plan. His target wasn't the students. It was Mr. Grady, the man who had humiliated him, broken him, and pushed him to the edge. But when Jake couldn't get to Grady, the plan spiraled out of control. The guilt was unbearable. Alex had saved lives, but at the cost of his brother's future. Jake was arrested, and the story became a headline, a tragedy that the community would never forget. In the days that followed, Alex struggled to come to terms with what had happened. They had stopped a shooter. They had done the right thing. But every time he closed their eyes, they saw Jake's face. The face of the person he loved most in the world, the person he never thought he'd fear. Was Jake a monster? Or was he someone who had been pushed too far, too fast, by a world that refused to show him kindness? Alex didn't know. And maybe they never would. Which of these stories left you haunted the most? Was it the chilling knocks in the night, the desperation of a forgotten revenge, or the masked truth of a brother's pain? Let me know in the comments. If you made it this far, don't forget to like this video. It helps more than you know. And if you